As you've already read and as you've likely observed in your own lives, conflict is unavoidable. The question then becomes, what can we do to manage the conflicts that we face in our lives and in our relationships? The first thing we can do is engage in productive rather than destructive conflict. We can engage in productive conflict by focusing on the specific rather than the general when we find ourselves in conflict situations with intercultural or other relational others. So when we focus on the specific, we talk to them about the exact words or the exact behaviors that upset us rather than relying on telling them about the things that they always do that upset us. And this is beneficial because when we focus on the specifics, we're highlighting the fact that the conflict has occurred because of particular actions and not because of the other individual as a person. So when we tell somebody that they always do something, we're telling them that they're flawed in that way. And so the conflict is happening because they're a flawed human being. That likely is not going to put the other individual in a situation where they really want to work with you. So we fare better in our intercultural and in our relational conflicts when we don't focus on telling the other person how they're flawed, but rather focusing on the specific behaviors in that specific instance that made us upset or made us angry. We also want to make sure that we limit conflict to the original issue. So sometimes when we fight, we start letting all sorts of past relational discretions come into that conversation or come into that argument. And when we do this, it's a process called kitchen sinking. So you've likely heard the phrase, we threw in everything but the kitchen sink. So when you're fighting and you bring back all those past transgressions, so all those bad things that the people in your relationships have done, you're engaged in this process called kitchen sinking. And that can be really problematic for a relationship because it reminds your relational other that you haven't forgiven them for the things that they've done in the past. So you've had this fight, you've had this conflict, they thought things were better, but when you start kitchen sinking, you remind them that those things are still there. So if in a conflict situation you can limit your conflict conversations to just the issue at hand, you are in a better position to solve those conflicts. You also need to work with your partner to solve the problem. So don't aim to get what you want out of the conflict by threatening your partner. So maybe you'd threaten to leave if they don't change. You want to aim to solve your problems by working through your issues with your partner. Finally, you need to work to find a mutually acceptable solution. So if you're managing a conflict by engaging in discussion with your partner, which is what you'd be doing if you're trying to find that mutually satisfactory solution, through that engagement or through that dialogue, you've put yourself in a good position to listen to both your partner's needs and to their ideas for coming up with an amicable solution. And so it's only when we listen to each other and we are willing to talk to each other and recognize where our relational partners are coming from that we can really find good and very effective solutions to the conflicts that we experience. So again, it's important that we work with our partners so we can find a solution that's satisfactory to both of us rather than one that simply satisfies one individual. The 4 guidelines I just talked about remind us that it's important to be cooperative rather than competitive when we manage conflict. So the guys in the picture, if they're not cooperating and working together, they're not going to win in the game of tug of war, right? One of those individuals can't stand out as the all-star tug of war individual because this particular event requires that they all work together if they're going to achieve their goals. Likewise, we have to work with one another and be cooperative if we want to resolve the intercultural conflicts that we find ourselves in. So when we work through things cooperatively and we create a positive atmosphere, what ends up happening in our relationships is that we enhance the trust that we have with one another, and we also enhance the flexibility that we have in finding new ways to solve problems and new ways to look at issues. This helps us have open communication because there's this recognition that when conflict arises, we can trust one another to share our deepest secrets and to share our deepest concerns and come up with a constructive solution. Right? So we can have that open communication and we can interact with one another because we've created this cooperative rather than competitive environment. It's about working together to find a solution. It's not about winning. Beyond these ideas, it's also really important to stay focused when we try and resolve our intercultural conflicts. So we can stay focused or stay centered when we dismiss either or thinking. So a lot of times we find ourselves in conflict situations where we assume it either has to be what I want or it's going to be what my relational partner wants. And when we stay centered, we're able to recognize that there are a lot more options out there than either what he or she wants or what I want. Right? There's a whole wealth of other ways we could solve this conflict. But again, we have to be willing to come to the table and have that discussion and have that open dialogue if we're going to come up with one of those solutions that works better for both parties. So when we stay centered, we keep from getting too angry. So while anger can creep in, we're able to set aside that anger and again engage in more productive ways of solving conflict, simply because we're recognizing from the beginning that we have this goal to accomplish and we're not focused on what we want and what we need as individuals. Rather, we're focused on what we want and what we need as relational partners. So we're doing this as a unit. When resolving intercultural conflict, you also want to maintain contact with the other person. And this doesn't mean that you're required to have fights right away. Lots of times it can be very beneficial to schedule a fight for later. So if one relational partner is really stressed at work, it might be really problematic to engage in a large relational conflict situation with that person while they're very stressed in other areas of their lives. So it's completely appropriate in that situation to say, I know you're dealing with some stuff right now, so we're going to put this on the back burner and we're going to come back to it at this date and at this time once that project at work is completed so that we can make sure that all of our needs are met. What we don't want to do and what maintaining contact reminds us is we don't just want to run away when conflict happens. So we don't want to sacrifice the relationship because we don't want to deal with the conflicts that are occurring in our lives. So when we make sure that we're interacting with one another in an attempt to deal with these conflicts, we are engaging in the process of dialogue. And dialogue is different than conversation because dialogue involves a bit more. It's a deeper enterprise than just having a conversation with someone. So when we're in a dialogue, this is this slow and careful way of interacting with someone. There's a lot of feeling involved in dialogue, and there's respect for the other person and attention that we pay to the other person. So when we're engaged in dialogue, we're really listening to the other person and we're attempting to understand their point of view. So how do they look at things? How do they understand the world? So when we enter into dialogue, we're not only attempting to listen to the words that we're saying, but we're trying to understand that person's worldview and understand their culture so that we can understand why they're looking to solve the problem the way they are or why they're perceiving the problem in our relationship in the way that they're doing that. So by maintaining contact, we have the opportunity to engage in dialogue, and it's through that dialogue that we can find solutions to our problems. Now, this idea of dialogue might remind you of a concept we talked about earlier in the semester, so invitational rhetoric, and those concepts are very similar. So if we accept an invitation to having interaction with somebody else, we are going to be engaging in a dialogue with them. So if a lot of what comes after this, as we talk about how to engage in productive dialogue, seems like this other concept we've already talked about, that's because there's a lot of similarities between those ideas. We're also going to manage intercultural conflict by remembering that there are different sides to every story. So we're going to recognize and accept that individuals come from different cultural backgrounds. And because they come from different cultural backgrounds, they're going to look at the world in different ways. When we accept that people see the world in different ways, we recognize that there are going to be many different sides to every story and to every conflict. And all of those sides are going to have validity, right? They're all valid because they all are experienced through an individual's unique cultural lens. So they're going to understand a situation differently than I am because they've had different experiences in the world. One of the things we don't want to do, and that we do tend to do a lot in conflict situations that's kind of problematic, is be civil and, quote, agree to disagree, right? So a lot of times we decide we're just going to agree to disagree on this one and we let the conflict go so that we can stop fighting because we want to be civil and we want to have these positive relations with someone. While that can be good because it's going to maintain the harmony in the relationship, it's also bad because we never actually confront that conflict issue. So if we can recognize and come to the table willing to engage in dialogue with someone else and interact with them and understand where they're coming from, we recognize that we don't really have to fear conflict as something that's bad, because conflict's going to be what enables us to see the world from our partner's perspective. So conflict then becomes something that's good, and we're not necessarily being civil by avoiding conflict. Instead, we confront that conflict so we can really come to understand and know where the other individual is coming from. We want to feel their side of the story and know their side of the story so we can recognize and fully comprehend why the conflict is occurring and what we can do as individuals to ensure that that conflict does not come back into our relationship. When working to resolve intercultural conflict, it's also important to take note of how you, as an individual, prefer to solve conflicts. So while we might change how we deal with conflicts given the context that we find ourselves in, we all do have conflict management styles that we tend to rely on or that we prefer to utilize in our day-to-day lives. So for example, when I deal with conflict in my marriage, I tend to be like the blonde woman on the left of your screen. I'm very direct. So I feel like my husband and I can resolve our conflicts because we have a strong relationship. So I'm not nervous about being direct with him because I feel like we have the relational capital that's going to enable me to be direct and confront these problems head on. My husband is more like the meditating guy. He wants to avoid conflict at all costs. So in the beginning of our relationship, this caused a lot of problems for us because if we engaged in a conflict, I was happy and I felt like positive things had happened and we were able to move forward, but he felt like there were bad things that were occurring in the relationship simply because the conflict happened. So if we avoided the conflict, he would be happy, but I would feel like there were these issues that were unresolved that were weighing on me. Now that we are more aware of our conflict management styles and what we prefer to use, we're able to be more productive in our conflicts because he knows that he has to let me express what's bothering me, and I know that I can't push him too far without making him uneasy. So we're able to manage the conflict within our relationship because we understand how each one of us prefers to engage in conflict. It's also important to be creative and to be flexible when we try and resolve intercultural conflicts. So if we're not willing to try new things, our efforts at solving an issue might not work because we have to be willing to look at the world in a different way and recognize that there might be solutions that are the best solutions that we never actually considered prior to engaging in our discussion. So like the quote says, if plan A doesn't work, there's plans B, C, D, E, and F that we can consider. So there's a lot of options, and we need to be flexible in which options we choose. Our cultural backgrounds can also make it so that we fall into certain patterns when we solve conflicts. So a lot of times we fight the ways that our parents fought. So we learn to resolve conflict when we watch how our parents resolve conflicts in our homes as we were growing up. So when we're adaptable and we're flexible, we're willing to embrace all of the diversity that looking at things from a new perspective brings. So we allow our partner to talk and we truly listen to them, and then we can learn something about their culture and how they think issues, or at least this particular issue, ought to be solved. And that helps us become more creative not only in solving this particular problem, but in solving future problems, because we recognize, well, maybe that way that I usually solve problems isn't the best because that didn't work in this context. So maybe I need to start thinking about things a little bit different when I find myself in conflict situations. So being flexible and being creative can be advantageous to us as we attempt to resolve intercultural conflict in our lives. As has been an important idea throughout this whole semester, context is also important when we try and resolve intercultural conflict. So we can't understand all context within the interpersonal relationships that we have. So there are larger contexts that come into play when we consider how and why conflicts happened. A student once described to me a problem that she and her significant other had when they were arguing. So her significant other's parents were divorced, in large part because they didn't deal with conflict well in their marriage. So while her significant other was fine with conflict most of the time, when they faced really big issues, he would start engaging in really problematic behaviors, likely because he saw his parents enact those behaviors and he thought that was how you engage in conflict. So when engaging in conflict, she would remind him of this because she wanted him to be aware of the fact that context really is important. And so that past history is important to understanding how he looks at conflict and why he looks at conflict in the ways that he does. So while it's strictly comedic and not at all related to intercultural communication, the comic on the screen reminds us that back that thing up to a coworker has very different meanings depending on the context. So again, it's this constant reminder that context matters. The final thing we need to remember when we're constructively dealing with conflict is to forgive our relational partners. We forgive by letting go, not by forgetting. So the statement, let's just forgive and forget, isn't really realistic. It's not simply about forgetting that this happened in the moment. When we forgive someone, we truly have to let go of all of the bad feelings and all the bad energy. And again, this reminds us that it's not fair later on to bring that back up in a relationship. If we're going to forgive, we need to let it go and move on and not allow that to come back into the relational fights or relational conflicts later on. When we have respect for our partners, it's a lot easier to forgive them and just move forward. We make the decision to forgive them because we value the relationship and we value the other person and what they bring to our lives. We forgive them because we don't want to carry the weight of all these past transgressions with us, so we'd rather forgive them and get it over with. So once we forgive, we enable conflict to be effectively resolved within our intercultural relationships. So this video presented us with a wider variety of ways to resolve conflicts than were presented in your textbook alone. In the end, we see a lot of tie-ins to the suggestions offered in this video and the invitational perspective that we discussed a few weeks ago. To effectively resolve conflicts, we have to be flexible and we have to be open-minded.